Tim Hardy had a simple life. Every morning, he would step out into his garden with a steaming cup of coffee, admiring his small patch of green. It wasn't a fancy garden, but it was his pride. Roses blooming in one corner, a tiny vegetable patch in another, and a neat little pathway winding through it all. On that particular morning, the sun was shining softly, and the world seemed calm, just as Tim liked it. As he took a sip of coffee, something caught his eye near the rose bushes. At first he thought it was a squirrel or a bird, but then he saw the unmistakable shape of a hedgehog. Small, spiky, and completely focused, it was digging furiously into the soil, throwing tiny clumps of dirt behind it like it had a purpose. Tim set his cup down and crouched near the bushes, curious. The hedgehog didn't seem to notice him. It was too busy, its tiny paws moving with surprising speed. Tim chuckled quietly. "What are you up to, little guy?" he murmured. The hedgehog paused for a moment, almost as if it had heard him, and then continued digging. This was unusual. Hedgehogs didn't usually come out during the day, and Tim had never seen one so determined. He leaned in closer, watching the small creature work. Minutes passed, and the hedgehog's tiny paws struck something solid. Tim heard the faint clink of metal. He frowned. What on earth? He grabbed a small trowel from his gardening tools and began digging alongside the hedgehog, careful not to scare it off. The soil was soft, and soon Tim's trowel hit something hard, a rusty, rectangular object buried about a foot deep. His heart raced. He brushed away the dirt and unearthed what looked like an old metal box. It was about the size of a shoebox, its surface worn and corroded with time. A tiny, rusty lock secured the lid. The hedgehog stepped back, its work apparently done. It stared at Tim with beady eyes, as if waiting for him to do something. Tim wiped the sweat off his brow and looked at the box. "Well, you're a curious little helper, aren't you?" he said to the hedgehog. The animal simply blinked and sat down. Tim picked up the box, feeling its weight. It wasn't too heavy, but it wasn't empty either. Something inside rattled slightly as he shook it. His curiosity was now fully piqued. "What did you find, buddy?" he muttered. He stood up and carried the box back to the patio, placing it on the table. The hedgehog followed him, waddling slowly but steadily. It was like the creature didn't want to leave him just yet. Tim couldn't help but laugh. "All right, you've got my attention. Let's see what's inside." Tim examined the lock. It was old and rusted but still holding firm. He tried pulling at it, but it wouldn't budge. "Figures," he said, reaching for a screwdriver from his garden shed. After a few minutes of fiddling, the lock finally gave way with a satisfying snap. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside the box, wrapped in what looked like an old cloth, were several items. A bundle of faded photographs, a small leather-bound diary, and what appeared to be a map. Tim's eyes widened. The photographs were black and white, showing a much younger version of his house, surrounded by people he didn't recognize. He unfolded the map next, his heart pounding. It was hand-drawn, with landmarks that looked vaguely familiar. At the bottom corner of the map was an X, marked boldly in red. The diary resting beneath the map was small and delicate, its pages yellowed with age. Tim opened it carefully, flipping through the pages filled with neat handwriting. The hedgehog, still sitting nearby, stared at him like it was waiting for a reaction. Tim couldn't help but grin. "You've got some sense of timing," he said. He glanced back at the map and diary, excitement building in his chest. What had he stumbled upon? Looking back at the garden, Tim realized this was no ordinary morning. The hedgehog's unexpected visit had sparked something, an adventure he hadn't seen coming. He glanced at the tiny creature, still sitting quietly by his side. "Well, little guy," he said, "I think we just found something big." The hedgehog twitched its nose, almost like it was agreeing, and Tim couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection. Whatever lay ahead, he had a feeling his peaceful mornings were about to get a lot more interesting. Tim sat at the patio table, staring at the contents of the mysterious box. His mind raced with questions. Who buried this? Why was it hidden in his garden? And most importantly, what was this map leading to? The hedgehog, now perched near his chair, seemed to watch him intently. "You've got a knack for finding trouble, don't you?" Tim said, shaking his head with a smile. He picked up the diary, turning its pages carefully. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, though faded with time. Most of it seemed to be notes about the house, repairs, sketches of improvements, and a few odd symbols scribbled in the margins. One page caught his eye. It had a short cryptic entry. "The workshop must stay hidden. If found, it could change everything." Tim leaned back, tapping the diary against his palm. "A workshop? Hidden? And what's this about changing everything?" He glanced at the map again. The X wasn't far from his property, a wooded area just beyond the garden fence. Curiosity burned in him. He grabbed the map and the hedgehog trailed after him as he stepped back into the garden. The creature's persistence amused him, but he felt a strange comfort having the little guy around. "All right, let's see if this treasure hunt of yours leads somewhere." Tim followed the map, comparing the rough landmarks to his surroundings. The old oak tree, the broken fence post, it all lined up perfectly. He arrived at a patch of ground near the edge of the woods that looked undisturbed but oddly out of place. The grass here was thinner, and the earth felt slightly raised underfoot. "This has to be it," Tim muttered. He grabbed a shovel from the shed and started digging. The hedgehog watched from a safe distance, occasionally sniffing the air. After several minutes of hard work, Tim's shovel struck something solid. It was a wooden trapdoor, its edges reinforced with rusted metal. Tim knelt to brush away the remaining dirt, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. He noticed a small, faded inscription on the metal frame. It read, "Knowledge and power lie beneath." Tim hesitated. Was this really a good idea? He glanced back at the hedgehog, who seemed unfazed by the discovery. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed the handle and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a dark staircase leading into the ground. "Well, this is getting interesting," Tim whispered to himself. He grabbed a flashlight from the shed, peering down into the abyss. The air was cool and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell. The hedgehog, surprisingly bold, waddled closer, sniffing the edges of the opening. Tim's heart pounded as he began descending the stairs, flashlight in one hand and the map clutched in the other. Whatever lay down there, he was determined to find out. The staircase was narrow and steep, the wooden steps creaking under Tim's weight. The light from his flashlight revealed rough stone walls lined with cobwebs, giving the space an eerie, forgotten feel. Each step echoed in the confined space, amplifying his nerves. At the bottom, he found himself in a small underground room. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and metal. Tim's flashlight swept across the room, revealing a cluttered workspace. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old tools, jars of strange materials, and what looked like blueprints rolled up in metal tubes. At the center of the room was a large, peculiar contraption covered in a dusty sheet. It loomed ominously in the dim light, its shape barely discernible. Tim stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing his hesitation. He reached out and pulled the sheet away, revealing a machine unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was a mix of polished brass, intricate gears, and glass tubes filled with strange, unmoving liquid. Wires coiled around the base, connecting to panels covered in switches and dials. Tim had no idea what it was, but it looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. "What were you working on down here?" he murmured, running his hand over the machine's surface. The hedgehog had followed him into the room, sniffing around the corners as if searching for something. It paused near a shelf, scratching at the wood. Tim walked over and found an old leather journal tucked behind some jars. He opened it, revealing pages filled with diagrams and notes about the machine. One entry stood out, the energy harvester, a solution to power the future. But its potential is dangerous if misused. It must stay hidden until the right time. Tim's eyes widened. Was this machine some kind of groundbreaking invention? His heart raced as he tried to make sense of the diagrams. From what he could tell, the machine was designed to generate energy, but its design was far more advanced than anything he'd seen before. Suddenly, a faint sound caught his attention, a soft click, like a switch being flipped. He spun around, flashlight trembling in his hand. The hedgehog was sitting near the base of the machine, its paw resting on a lever. The machine began to hum faintly, its gears turning slowly as light flickered inside the glass tubes. "Whoa, buddy, what did you just do?" Tim exclaimed, backing away slightly. The machine seemed to come alive, its mechanisms moving with a strange, mesmerizing rhythm. The hum grew louder, filling the room with a low vibration. Tim stood frozen, watching the machine. He had a feeling this discovery was far more significant and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And the hedgehog? It simply looked up at him, as if saying, "Well, what's next?" Tim stood in the dimly lit workshop, the hum of the machine echoing around him. The gears moved smoothly, and faint pulses of light flickered inside the glass tubes. It wasn't loud, but the vibrations made the air feel alive. He stared at the contraption, his mind racing with questions. What was this thing? Why had someone hidden it here? And most importantly, what was it capable of? The hedgehog, now perched near the base of the machine, looked up at Tim as if expecting him to do something. "You got some nerve, you know that?" Tim muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He turned back to the journal he'd found, flipping through its pages for answers. The diagrams and notes were detailed but cryptic. It was clear this wasn't just some ordinary invention. One entry stood out: "The harvester is more than energy. It is hope for the future. But in the wrong hands, it could become a weapon. Secrecy is our only safeguard." Tim frowned. A weapon. He glanced back at the humming machine. Its glow had grown slightly brighter, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. He felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't something to take lightly. As he examined the machine more closely, he noticed a control panel on one side. It was covered in buttons, levers, and dials, each labeled with faded text. One large switch was prominently marked with the word "Activate." Tim hesitated, his hand hovering over the switch. He had no idea what the machine would do if fully powered, but his curiosity was too strong to resist. Just as he was about to flip the switch, a noise from above stopped him cold. A faint creak, like a footstep on the floorboards above the trapdoor. Tim froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't told anyone about his discovery. Who could be up there? Quickly, he turned off the flashlight and crouched behind a shelf, his eyes fixed on the staircase. The workshop was plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the machine. The hum seemed louder now, filling the silence like a warning. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then, another sound, a soft scraping, like someone opening the trapdoor. Tim held his breath, his hands clenched into fists. The hedgehog, seemingly unfazed, waddled over to the base of the stairs and stared up, its nose twitching. A figure appeared at the top of the staircase, silhouetted against the faint light from above. The person descended slowly, their movements deliberate. Tim squinted, trying to make out details. Whoever it was, they weren't here by accident. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, their gaze sweeping the room. They were tall, wearing a dark jacket and gloves. In their hand they held a flashlight, which they switched on, scanning the shelves and the machine. Tim's heart sank. This wasn't some curious neighbor or lost wanderer. This person was searching for something, and they'd come prepared. The stranger approached the machine, their flashlight lingering on its intricate details. They muttered something under their breath, but Tim couldn't make out the words. He stayed perfectly still, his mind racing for a plan. The hedgehog, however, had other ideas. It suddenly darted across the floor, its tiny claws clicking against the stone. The stranger jumped, their flashlight swinging wildly to follow the noise. "What the?" they exclaimed, stepping back. Tim seized the opportunity. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the shelf and crept toward the stranger. The hum of the machine masked his movements as he closed the distance. Just as the stranger turned back toward the machine, Tim lunged, grabbing their arm and shoving them against the wall. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Tim demanded, his voice low but firm. The stranger struggled, but Tim held his grip. Up close he could see their face, a man in his late 30s, with sharp features and a look of surprise quickly turning into anger. "I should be asking you the same thing," the man spat. "This place doesn't belong to you." Tim tightened his grip. "Answer the question. How do you know about this workshop?" The man hesitated, then smirked. "You don't even know what you found, do you? That machine isn't just some relic. It's a key to something much bigger." Tim's stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" Before the man could answer, the machine's hum grew louder and the glass tubes began to glow brighter. Both men turned to look as the vibrations intensified. The stranger's smirk faded, replaced by a look of concern. "You activated it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Tim released him, stepping back toward the machine. "What happens now?" he asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he bolted up the stairs, disappearing into the night. Tim stood frozen, the machine's hum now a low roar. The hedgehog scurried to his side, nudging his foot as if urging him to act. "All right," Tim muttered, steeling himself. "Let's figure out what we're dealing with." The machine's hum began to stabilize, the vibrations settling into a steady rhythm. Tim stared at it, the stranger's words echoing in his mind. "It's a key to something much bigger." He turned back to the journal, flipping through the pages again. The inventor's notes hinted at the machine's purpose but didn't fully explain its function. The map caught his eye again. Its marked X wasn't in the workshop, but in the wooded area nearby. Tim had assumed the workshop was the final destination, but now he wasn't so sure. What if the map led to something else? Grabbing the map, a flashlight, and a sturdy crowbar, Tim climbed out of the workshop, the hedgehog following close behind. The cool night air hit him, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic warmth of the underground room. He scanned the dark woods ahead, the flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The map was detailed but old, and some landmarks were harder to recognize in the dark. Tim moved cautiously, stepping over roots and brushing past low-hanging branches. The hedgehog kept pace, its tiny form darting ahead like it knew the way. Finally, Tim reached the spot marked on the map. It was a clearing surrounded by tall trees, the ground covered in a thick layer of leaves. He knelt, comparing the map's markings to his surroundings. There was no obvious sign of anything buried or hidden, but he trusted the map. Using the crowbar, he began scraping away the leaves and digging into the soft earth. Minutes passed, and Tam's muscles ached, but he kept going. Just as doubt began to creep in, his crowbar struck something solid. He dug faster, uncovering what looked like another trapdoor, smaller but sturdier than the one in the workshop. A heavy padlock secured it, rusted but intact. Tam's heart raced as he examined the lock, realizing it bore the same inscription as the one in the workshop. Knowledge and power lie beneath. The hedgehog sniffed at the edges of the door, then sat back as if waiting. Tim took a deep breath, gripping the crowbar tightly. With a powerful swing, he struck the lock, the metal bending under the force. A few more hits, and it finally gave way. He pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. A ladder extended down, its rungs slick with age. Tim hesitated, his mind racing with possibilities. What could be down there? Another workshop? A vault? Something dangerous? The hedgehog nudged his foot, breaking his thoughts. "All right, little guy," Tim said, gripping the ladder. "Let's see what's waiting for us." He descended into the unknown, the darkness swallowing him as the adventure deepened. Tim climbed down the ladder cautiously, the air growing colder and damper as he descended. The flashlight beam wavered, casting long shadows on the stone walls of the shaft. Below him, the hedgehog scurried down with surprising agility, its small frame fitting easily between the rungs. "You're fearless, aren't you?" Tim muttered under his breath, gripping the ladder tightly. Finally, his feet touched solid ground. He swept the flashlight across the space, revealing a small, vaulted chamber. The room was rectangular, its walls carved from smooth stone. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, but the room was eerily pristine for its apparent age. At the center of the chamber stood a large, rectangular pedestal, atop which rested a metallic box. Tim's pulse quickened. The box was sleek, its surface etched with intricate designs and symbols that mirrored those in the inventor's diary. A faint glow emanated from the seams of the box, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Surrounding the pedestal were more objects, old tools, sealed jars, and stacks of faded blueprints, all arranged neatly as though someone had carefully curated the space. Tim stepped forward, his shoes crunching on the gravelly floor. The hedgehog trotted ahead, sniffing the air before stopping at the pedestal. Tim knelt beside the box, his fingers tracing the carvings. It wasn't locked, but something about its glow made him hesitate. The diary's warning echoed in his mind. The harvester's power must remain hidden. Only those with pure intentions may use it. "What's in here?" Tim whispered, half to himself and half to the hedgehog. With a deep breath, he placed both hands on the box and lifted the lid. Inside was a small device, no larger than a shoebox. It was constructed from the same polished brass and glass as the machine in the workshop, with delicate gears visible through transparent panels. The light from the box intensified as Tim picked it up, illuminating the chamber in a soft, golden glow. The moment he lifted the device, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the stone walls. The glow from the device spread to the carvings on the pedestal, which began to pulse in sync. Tim's grip tightened as he realized this wasn't just some forgotten relic, it was alive, responding to his presence. Suddenly, a grinding noise echoed from the walls. Tim spun around, holding the device tightly. The noise grew louder, and a section of the chamber wall shifted, revealing a hidden doorway. Tim's heart pounded as he aimed the flashlight at the opening. Beyond the doorway was a narrow passageway, leading further into the earth. The hedgehog nudged his leg, its nose pointing toward the passage. "You've got to be kidding me," Tim said, shaking his head. "This just keeps getting better." Realizing there was no turning back, he stepped into the passage, the device in his hands lighting the way. The passageway was damp and cold, the air thick with the scent of stone and earth. Tim followed its winding path, his footsteps echoing faintly. The glow from the device cast strange patterns on the walls, making the narrow corridor feel alive. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Tim stopped in his tracks, his breath catching at the sight before him. The room was massive, its high ceiling supported by stone columns. At the center of the space was a machine, larger and far more intricate than the one in his workshop. This machine seemed ancient yet futuristic, with its towering frame of brass and steel adorned with glowing panels and rotating gears. The air vibrated with its low hum, similar to the smaller machine but far more powerful. Tim's hands tightened around the device he carried as he stepped closer. A series of symbols etched into the floor connected the smaller device to the larger machine, like a pathway of glowing veins. Tim crouched to inspect them, realizing they were similar to the markings in the diary and on the pedestal. The pattern seemed to guide him toward the base of the machine where an empty slot waited. He placed the device in the slot carefully, and as it clicked into place, the room came alive. The hum grew louder and the machine's gears began turning, light spreading across its surface like rippling water. A panel on the machine lit up, displaying text that made Tim's jaw drop. Energy stabilization complete. Awaiting activation. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a functioning power source, capable of harnessing energy in ways he couldn't comprehend. The diary's cryptic warnings now made sense. This machine wasn't just powerful, it was dangerous in the wrong hands. Before he could process further, a voice startled him. "You shouldn't have done that." Tim spun around, his flashlight illuminating the stranger from earlier. The man stood at the entrance of the chamber, his face shadowed but his tone unmistakably firm. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the stone floor. "I warned you," the man said, his gaze fixed on the machine. "Do you even know what this thing is?" Tim squared his shoulders, gripping the flashlight tightly. "I know enough, and I know you're not here to help." The man smirked, his hands resting casually at his sides. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth. This isn't some toy you can mess with. That machine could power a city, or destroy it." Tim's jaw tightened. "Then why are you here? To take it? To sell it to the highest bidder?" The stranger's smirk faded. "You think I want to sell this? I'm trying to protect it. People would kill for what you've just activated. And now, thanks to you, they'll come looking." Tim's stomach churned. The machine's glow intensified, casting long shadows across the chamber. He glanced at the hedgehog, which had moved to a safe corner, watching the confrontation unfold. "Shut it down," the man demanded, his tone sharp. "Now, before it's too late." Tim hesitated. His instincts told him not to trust the stranger, but the warning in his voice sounded genuine. The machine continued to hum, its power growing stronger with each passing second. "Make a choice, Hardy," the man said, stepping closer. "Turn it off, or face the consequences." Tim clenched his fists, his mind racing. Whatever decision he made, he knew there was no going back. Tim stood frozen, his mind spinning as the machine's hum grew louder. The air in the chamber felt charged, like static before a storm. The stranger's words echoed in his ears. "Turn it off, or face the consequences." Tim glanced back at the machine, its intricate gears spinning faster, light pulsing across its surface. He didn't fully understand what he'd activated, but the energy radiating from it was undeniable and terrifying. "I'm not shutting it down until I know what it does," Tim said firmly, meeting the stranger's intense gaze. The man cursed under his breath, stepping closer. "You don't get it, do you? This thing wasn't meant to be powered up again. It's a Pandora's box. Whatever energy it's generating, it's not stable. You're risking more than just this chamber." Tim's grip tightened on the flashlight in his hand. "If it's so dangerous, why did you come here? Who are you, and what do you really want?" The stranger sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "The name's Carter. Let's just say I'm a keeper of things like this. Machines, technology, inventions that shouldn't fall into the wrong hands. And right now, you've got your hands on the most dangerous one I've ever seen." Tim frowned, his skepticism warring with the urgency in Carter's voice. "Why didn't you shut it down yourself?" "Because," Carter snapped, "it's not that simple. The device you put in the slot acts like a key. Once it's locked in, it starts a chain reaction. Removing it now could destabilize the entire system." Tim's stomach sank. He turned back to the machine, its glow now almost blinding. The air vibrated with energy, and the symbols on the floor pulsed in time with the machine's hum. "So what do we do?" Tim asked, his voice low. Carter hesitated. "There's a failsafe, a way to stabilize the energy and shut it down safely. But it's risky, and we don't have much time." The hedgehog, watching from a corner, suddenly scurried toward the base of the machine. It stopped near a small panel Tim hadn't noticed before, scratching at it. Tim knelt down, opening the panel to reveal a series of switches and wires. "What is this?" Tim asked, looking at Carter. Carter's eyes widened. "That's it, the failsafe. But you better hope you know what you're doing, because one wrong move could make this whole place go up in flames." Tim's heart pounded as he examined the switches, each labeled with faded symbols. "You said you're a keeper. Care to help?" Carter crouched beside him, pointing at a sequence in the journal Tim had brought. "These symbols match the ones on the panel. If we follow this order, we can stabilize it, but we'll need to be fast." As Carter guided him through the sequence, Tim's hands moved quickly but carefully, flipping switches and reconnecting wires. The machine's hum fluctuated, growing louder before quieting again. The final switch loomed in front of him. Tim hesitated, his fingers hovering over it. "What happens if this doesn't work?" Carter met his eyes, his expression grim. "We won't have to worry about it. We'll be gone before we can regret it." Tim swallowed hard and flipped the switch. The moment Tim flipped the final switch, the chamber was engulfed in blinding light. He shielded his eyes, the vibrations in the air so intense they seemed to shake the ground beneath him. The machine let out a deafening roar, its gears spinning so fast they blurred. "Did we do it?" Tim shouted over the noise, his voice barely audible. Carter didn't answer immediately, his focus locked on the machine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room plunged into silence, broken only by the faint hum of the machine, now stable and steady. Tim lowered his arm, blinking against the afterimages. The machine's glow had dimmed, its energy no longer radiating wildly. Instead, it seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat. The symbols on the floor stopped glowing, leaving only faint traces of light. "It worked," Carter said, exhaling a deep breath. "You stabilized it." Tim slumped against the wall, his legs trembling from the adrenaline. The hedgehog waddled over to him, nudging his hand as if to check on him. He laughed weakly, giving the tiny creature a pat. "Looks like you knew what you were doing all along, huh?" Carter stood, brushing dust off his jacket. "You're lucky it worked. If even one wire was out of place." He let the thought hang in the air. Tim shook his head, still catching his breath. "So what now? Do we just leave it here?" Carter's expression darkened. "We don't have a choice. Moving it isn't an option. It's too dangerous. But now that it's been activated, it's only a matter of time before others come looking for it." Tim frowned. "Others? Who?" "People who'll do anything for power," Carter said grimly. "Governments, corporations, individuals with more money than morals. This machine could give them unlimited energy, or destroy everything if they misuse it." Tim stood, the weight of the situation sinking in. He looked at the machine, its steady hum filling the chamber with an almost calming presence. "So we just wait for them to come?" Carter shook his head. "No, we make sure they don't find it. I have a team, a network of people who specialize in keeping things like this hidden. But it won't be easy. This place isn't exactly inconspicuous anymore." Tim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't sign up for this, you know." "No one ever does," Carter said, his tone softer. "But you did the right thing. That counts for something." As the two men began discussing plans to secure the machine, the hedgehog climbed onto the pedestal, sitting beside the glowing device as if guarding it. Tim couldn't help but smile. "Looks like we got ourselves a watchman," he said. Carter chuckled. "Not a bad one, either." The chamber grew quiet again, the machine's hum a reminder of the power they had contained for now. Tim knew this wasn't the end, but for the first time he felt a strange sense of purpose. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. The chamber was quiet now, save for the low hum of the stabilized machine. Tim sat on the cold stone floor, staring at the glowing contraption. Despite the momentary calm, his mind was anything but settled. Carter's warning lingered in the air. "They'll come looking for it. How long do we have before someone finds this place?" Tim asked, breaking the silence. Carter, who had been inspecting the machine for vulnerabilities, looked up. "Not long. The activations send out an energy pulse, like a beacon. If anyone's been monitoring for this kind of activity, they'll know something's here. A day, maybe less." Tim's chest tightened. He'd stumbled into this mess purely by accident, but now it felt like his responsibility. "What's the plan?" "We secure the chamber and wipe any trace of this place from the surface," Carter replied, his tone sharp and decisive. "No one should even suspect this machine exists." Tim nodded, though doubt gnawed him. "And if they do find it?" Carter's jaw tightened. "We make sure they don't leave with it." The two men worked quickly. Carter explained that the machine's energy signature could be masked temporarily by sealing the chamber with an electromagnetic field. It wasn't foolproof, but it would buy them time. Tim helped Carter gather materials from the workshop, the pair moving with urgency. Meanwhile, the Hedgehog remained a silent observer, following Tim as he moved back and forth between the chambers. Every so often, it would scratch at a corner or sniff the edges of the machine as though it were guarding the space. By the time they finished setting up the field, the chamber felt even more isolated. The glow of the machine dimmed slightly as the energy field encased it, reducing its detectable signature. Carter wiped sweat from his brow and stepped back to inspect their work. "That'll do for now," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. "But this is just a patch job. Sooner or later, someone will break through it." Tim leaned against the wall, exhaustion setting in. "You keep saying they. Who are you talking about?" Carter hesitated before answering. "There's a group, let's just call them collectors. They're always hunting for old tech, artifacts, anything that gives them an edge. They don't care about the consequences, only the power it brings." Tim's stomach churned. "And they know about this." "They'll know soon enough," Carter said grimly. "And when they do, they won't stop until they have it." The weight of the situation pressed down on Tim. He wasn't a soldier or a spy, just an ordinary man who happened to find a hedgehog digging in his garden. But now he felt like he was standing at the edge of something far bigger than himself. "We need a plan," Tim said firmly. "If they're coming, we need to be ready." Carter nodded. "We'll set traps, block the entrances, anything to slow them down. And if it comes to it—" He paused, glancing at the machine. "We'll destroy it before they can take it." Tim didn't like the thought of destroying something so powerful and unique, but he understood the stakes. Together, they began preparing for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. It was just past midnight when the first sign of trouble appeared. Tim and Carter had finished setting up makeshift barricades around the trapdoor and were keeping watch from the surface. The Hedgehog, as if sensing the tension, stayed close to Tim, its small frame barely visible in the moonlight. A faint rustling came from the woods. At first, Tim thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again, deliberate, steady. Carter raised a hand, signaling for silence. "They're here," Carter whispered, his voice barely audible. Tim's pulse quickened as he scanned the darkness. Shapes moved among the trees, shadows slipping silently between the trunks. Whoever they were, they knew how to stay hidden. Carter pulled a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. A faint beep sounded, and the electromagnetic field around the trapdoor activated. The ground beneath them gave off a faint hum, almost imperceptible. "Stay low," Carter murmured. "If they get close, we let the traps do their work." Tim crouched behind a bush, his flashlight turned off. The Hedgehog stayed by his side, its small eyes glinting in the dark. The intruders grew bolder as they neared the clearing. Tim counted at least 3 figures, all dressed in dark clothing and carrying tools. They moved with practiced ease, their movements quiet but purposeful. One of them stopped near the trapdoor, crouching to inspect the ground. "It's here," the figure said, their voice low but clear. Tim clenched his fists, his heart pounding. Carter motioned for him to stay put, then crept closer to the clearing. The figure reached for the trapdoor, but the moment they touched it, the first trap activated. A loud metallic clang echoed through the clearing as a spring-loaded net shot up, ensnaring the figure. They let out a startled cry, struggling against the web of wires. The other intruders reacted instantly, one of them pulling out a knife to cut the net while the other scanned the area. Carter took advantage of the distraction, stepping into the clearing with a flashlight pointed directly at them. "Stop right there," he shouted, his voice commanding. The intruders froze for a moment, then scattered into the trees. Tim emerged from his hiding spot, his flashlight sweeping the area. "Don't let them get away," Carter yelled, sprinting after one of the fleeing figures. Tim hesitated, unsure whether to follow, but the Hedgehog darted ahead, chasing after another shadow. "You've got to be kidding me," Tim muttered, running after it. He followed the tiny creature through the woods, the sound of breaking branches and hurried footsteps guiding him. Ahead he spotted one of the intruders, their silhouette outlined by the faint moonlight. "Stop," Tim shouted, though he wasn't sure what he'd do if they didn't. The intruder turned briefly, then disappeared into the trees. By the time Tim caught up, they were gone, leaving him alone in the dark. The Hedgehog returned to his side, its nose twitching as if disappointed. When Tim made his way back to the clearing, Carter was already there, breathing heavily. "They're gone," Carter said, his frustration clear. "For now," Tim replied, glancing at the trapdoor. "But they'll be back." Carter nodded grimly, "and next time they won't come unprepared." The quiet returned, but it was uneasy, charged with the knowledge that the first battle was only a warning of what was to come. The morning after the intruders' retreat was eerily quiet. The woods around Tim's property, usually alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves, felt tense and heady, as if nature itself anticipated what was coming. Tim and Carter worked tirelessly, reinforcing their defenses and preparing for the inevitable second wave. Tim glanced at the hedgehog, sitting calmly on a rock nearby, as if it had no doubt they would succeed. He smirked. "Wish I had your confidence, buddy," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Confidence won't stop them," Carter muttered, checking a line of tripwires he'd set around the clearing. "We need to make sure everything works exactly as planned." Tim nodded, though his nerves were fraying. The night before had proven that the people coming for the machine were skilled and determined. If they came back in greater numbers, or better prepared, he wasn't sure they could hold them off, but the alternative was unthinkable. Letting the machine fall into the wrong hands wasn't an option. As night fell, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Tim and Carter took positions around the trapdoor, their flashlights off to avoid drawing attention. The hedgehog, ever fearless, had settled near Tim's feet, its tiny body nearly invisible in the shadows. Hours passed, the quiet stretching thinner with each tick of the clock. Then, just after midnight, the first sound came. A faint rustle in the distance. Carter, crouched near the edge of the clearing, tensed immediately. "They're here," he whispered. Tim strained his ears, and soon he heard it too, soft, deliberate movements through the underbrush. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, his heart pounding. The faint glow of moonlight revealed shadows slipping between the trees, more of them this time. 5, maybe 6 figures emerged into the clearing, their movements cautious but coordinated. Unlike the night before, they carried more than tools. Tim spotted weapons glinting in the faint light. He swallowed hard, glancing at Carter, who nodded grimly. One of the intruders approached the trapdoor, motioning for the others to spread out. As they neared the electromagnetic field, the air seemed to hum faintly, a warning Tim hoped they wouldn't notice. "Wait for it," Carter whispered, his hand hovering over a small remote. "We need them in the right position." The intruders moved closer, their leader kneeling to examine the ground around the trapdoor. The moment they touched it, Carter pressed the button. A series of traps triggered simultaneously. Nets shot out from concealed mechanisms, ensnaring 2 of the intruders, while a burst of light from a hidden device blinded the others momentarily. The sudden chaos broke the intruders' formation, and Tim sprang into action. He charged forward, his flashlight swinging like a club. The hedgehog darted ahead, its small form somehow managing to trip one of the intruders as they stumbled blindly. Tim couldn't believe what he was seeing, but had no time to marvel at the creature's bravery. Carter, more practiced in these situations, moved with precision. He tackled one of the armed figures, disarming them before they could recover from the blinding light. A scuffle broke out, the quiet of the night shattered by the sounds of struggle. Tim found himself face to face with one of the intruders, their expression hidden behind a mask. They lunged at him, but he ducked, swinging his flashlight with all his strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and the intruder crumpled to the ground. "Tim, watch out." Carter's shout came too late. A sharp pain shot through Tim's shoulder as another intruder tackled him from the side, sending him sprawling. The flashlight flew from his hand, skittering across the ground. The attacker loomed over him, raising a knife. Just as Tim braced himself, the hedgehog charged, ramming into the attacker's leg. The surprise was enough to throw them off balance, and Tim took the opportunity to grab a nearby rock, slamming it into their hand and disarming them. "Good timing, little guy," Tim muttered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fight raged on, but Carter and Tim had the advantage. The traps and their quick reactions had thinned the intruders' numbers, and the remaining attackers began to retreat, dragging their injured comrades with them. "Don't let them escape," Carter yelled, chasing after the last 2. Tim stayed back, his shoulder throbbing and his legs shaky. He retrieved his flashlight, scanning the clearing for any signs of movement. The hedgehog, now sitting atop the trapdoor, looked up at him as if to say, "We did it." Carter returned a few minutes later, breathing heavily. "They're gone, for now, but they'll regroup. We need to move fast." Tim nodded, the weight of their situation settling heavily on him. The machine had been protected, but at what cost? He wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out. Carter inspected the machine in the underground chamber, ensuring the electromagnetic field was still intact. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "We need to relocate the machine. They'll keep coming until they get it. And how do we move something like this without drawing attention?" Tim asked, leaning against the wall. His shoulder throbbed, but he ignored it. Carter's face was grim. I have a team that can help, but getting them here will take time, and we'll need to keep this place secure until then. Tim sighed, running a hand through his hair. This just keeps getting worse. Welcome to the club, Carter said, a faint smirk breaking through his serious demeanor. As they prepared for the next steps, Tim couldn't help but glance at the hedgehog, now curled up near the base of the machine. The tiny creature had proven itself a surprising ally, and Tim felt a strange sense of gratitude. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. The fight to protect the machine, and whatever it represented, had only just begun. The morning after the attack, the clearing was silent. Tim sat on the edge of the trapdoor, his back against a tree, his body aching from the skirmish. The events of the night felt like a blur, a chaotic mix of fear, adrenaline, and survival. His shoulder throbbed from the tackle, and his hands bore fresh scrapes from the fight. He glanced down at the hedgehog curled up beside him, its spines bristling slightly in the morning light. "You've got more fight in you than most people I know," Tim said with a tired smile. The little creature twitched its nose, seemingly unbothered by the chaos it had been part of. Carter emerged from the underground chamber, his face pale but determined. "The machine's secure for now," he said, wiping dirt off his hands. "But we've got a lot of work ahead of us." Tim sighed, letting his head fall back against the tree. "You mean there's more to this?" Carter chuckled grimly. "This is just the beginning. We delayed them, but they'll be back, and they'll bring more firepower. We can't stay here." Tim looked at the trapdoor, now reinforced with the traps and mechanisms they'd built. It felt like a fragile bandage over a wound that couldn't heal. "So what's the plan?" Carter crouched next to him, pulling out a small map. "I've got a safe location, a place where we can move the machine without drawing attention. But it's far, and getting it there won't be easy." Tim raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly are we supposed to move something like that without anyone noticing?" Carter smirked. Carefully. "I have a team I can call. They specialize in transporting sensitive cargo. It'll take a couple of days to get them here, though." "Great," Tim muttered. "So we just have to keep playing defense until then." "Pretty much," Carter replied, standing and stretching. "But we've got the advantage now. They won't try another frontal assault, not after last night." Underscore 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 underscore. As the day stretched on, Tim and Carter worked on fortifying the area. They reset traps, sealed weak points in the underground chamber, and set up motion detectors around the clearing. Every sound in the woods felt like a potential threat, but the day passed without incident. Tim found himself growing restless. "Do you think they'll come back tonight?" he asked Carter as they ate a quick meal near the workshop. Carter shrugged. "If they're smart, they'll wait, gather intel, plan their next move. But we can't afford to let our guard down." Tim glanced at the hedgehog, now sniffing around the edge of the workshop. It had stayed by his side through everything, and he felt a strange sense of connection to the little creature. "You ever think it's weird how that guy showed up the day all this started?" Carter followed his gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe he knew something you didn't. Animals have instincts we can't explain. Maybe he was meant to lead you to this." Tim laughed. "Yeah, right. A hedgehog with a master plan. Sounds like something out of a kid's movie." But as the words left his mouth, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The hedgehog had been there every step of the way, guiding him, even saving his life. Whether it was instinct or something deeper, Tim was grateful for its presence. That night, Tim sat by the trapdoor, the cool air biting at his skin. Carter had taken the first watch, patrolling the edge of the clearing. Tim stared at the stars above, his thoughts drifting. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. Just days ago, his biggest concern had been keeping the rose bushes alive. Now he was guarding a machine that could change, or destroy, the world. He looked down at the hedgehog, which had settled into a ball beside him. "What do you think, buddy?" Tim asked softly. "Did I make a mistake getting involved in this?" The hedgehog didn't respond, of course, but its steady presence felt like an answer in itself. Tim smiled faintly. "Yeah, you're probably right. Can't back out now." By dawn, Carter returned to the trapdoor, his expression grim. "We got movement on the other side of the woods," he said. "Scouts, most likely. They're testing our defenses." Tim's jaw tightened. "What do we do?" "We stick to the plan," Carter replied. "Hold them off until my team gets here. If we can make it another day or two, we'll be in the clear." The hours that followed were tense but uneventful. The scouts didn't approach, but their presence was a constant reminder that the enemy wasn't far. Tim and Carter stayed vigilant, taking turns on watch. Finally, just as the sun began to set, Carter's radio crackled to life. "This is Hawk," a voice said. "We're approaching your location. ETA 30 minutes. Carter's relief was palpable. "They're here," he told Tim. "We're getting out of this." When Carter's team arrived, they moved with military precision. A group of 6 individuals, all dressed in dark, tactical gear, quickly assessed the situation and began preparing the machine for transport. Tim watched in awe as they worked, their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. "You got some impressive friends," Tim said to Carter. "They're the best," Carter replied, "and they'll make sure this thing gets where it needs to go." As the team loaded the machine into a reinforced truck, Tim felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The past few days had been a whirlwind, and now it was all coming to an end. The hedgehog, as if sensing the change, climbed onto Tim's lap, looking up at him with its beady eyes. Tim smiled, stroking its spines gently. "You've been my partner through all this," he said. "Guess we'll finally get some peace, huh?" As the truck disappeared down the road, Carter clapped Tim on the shoulder. "You did good," he said. Tim nodded, though the weight of the experience still lingered. "What happens now?" "Now," Carter said, "you go back to your life, and we make sure this machine stays hidden, no matter what." Tim watched as Carter followed his team into the woods, leaving him alone in the clearing. The hedgehog remained at his side, its tiny presence a reminder of everything they'd been through. "Well," Tim said, standing and dusting himself off, "I guess it's just us now." The hedgehog twitched its nose and followed him back to the house. And for the first time in days, Tim allowed himself to breathe.